Welcome to the North Group podcast. At North Group, we are invited into organizations to influence leadership and organizational behavior. It is absolutely fascinating work. Today, we invite you into one of those conversations.
My name is Gina Breslin, and today I am hosting the North Group podcast. I am joined by my colleague, Daryl Leisey. Daryl, you've been a long-time influential partner here at North Group. How long have you been with North Group?
Let's see, it's been a little over 20 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
So I'm pretty fair in saying long-term. Well, thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to your insights.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So we talk with a lot of leaders, and I think most leaders would agree that stewardship of the resources of our organization is pretty important. And so my question for you is, what would you say are an organization's most important or most valuable resource?
Well, I would think without any hesitation, really any of us would say our people with absolute confidence that they are our most important resource for sure.
So I thought you might say that, but are you sure? Because I just toured a company here in Lancaster not that long ago, and they use these big pieces of equipment, and they cost millions each, 7, 8, 9 million, and then you think too about, the whole no margin, no mission, you need cash to run your business, but you're going to stick with people as your answer?
Yes. I mean, it's not done outside of a context.
Sure.
We need to have products, we need to have services, but in order for those things to move forward, obviously we need to have the people and the right people, who can help us to advance that. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we could probably change those cliches, if you will.
Yeah.
So when we think about people as our most valuable resource, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing organizations in regards to their people?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, we talk about a post-pandemic world, but it really is about the idea of how do we create a culture that both attracts and retains our best people. And it's been interesting to me over the years prior to coming here to North Group. My roles were in human resources, and so these were the conversations that happened all the time. And so often I think we can misconstrue the concept of culture. And we have great, I believe in many companies, great intentions, but how do those intentions align with our behaviors or vice versa? And I think that, again, people have great intentions, but what does it really mean? Gina, I've said this a number of times. As an example, I've walked with many companies over the years who've said they have an open door policy.
Sure.
We've heard that time and time again.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Absolutely.
Right?
It sounds good. But then I've also heard people say, but nobody comes in. And then I would ask them, well, when's the last time you invited somebody in? And so, again, the intention of an open door policy does not necessarily align with the behaviors of those leaders. And again, it's not like somebody's waking up in the morning saying, I'm going to mess with people today, or I really don't care about my people.
Sure.
It's just we get so wrapped up in, I think, some of the day-to-day things that we can easily forget, even the best of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. When we think about this idea of retention and recruitment, it's the largest challenge facing organizations, or one of the largest challenges facing organizations today, we also know it's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
So there are a couple of statistics. So 1 million people for 1.7 million jobs. Well, that math doesn't work. Then there's the fact that 31% of new employees quit within their first 6 months. That's not a great statistic either. And then the third one is that average businesses experience 18% turnover annually, with many sectors who would actually have numbers higher than that. So birth rates are down, attitudes in the workplace have changed. We no longer have the influence of the greatest generation, using the air quotes there on that. And then we have this idea of remote work. Some people seem to want to go to work in their pajamas. And there's times when remote work's been very beneficial, but how does this fit in? What do you make of these statistics, and how does this connect to retention and recruitment?
Well, again, when we talk about culture specifically as it relates to retention and recruitment, we have to be honest with ourselves. I was talking to a firm not so long ago, and they talked about this the transition to remote work. So initially they were completely remote.
Okay.
Then they began to come back, and there was an option. There were a number of options. One is you could stay remote.
Okay.
The other one is you could have a hybrid approach, and the third one is you can come back full time. And so they did that for a period of time, and they found that in their case that the turnover remained, I think, pretty much the same, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
But what began to happen was when they began to hire remote workers from the outset, the turnover went significantly higher. And you think about culture, not just obviously, as you were saying, not just in the context of everybody in one space, but we have this challenge as we move forward. It was interesting. My son works for a large company, and he was hired as a remote worker.
Okay.
And about a month ago, they got a notice that said, we're calling everybody back. And so it was interesting, number levels up as he and I talked. We're unaware that was coming down the pike. And so he's a remote worker and says, I'm not really sure what that means.
Right.
And so you think about, even the culture there, which was intriguing. It wasn't just about coming back, but it was about numerous layers of individuals had no idea that even that conversation was in the works. And so you think about what that looks like from a cultural perspective, let alone remote workers, hybrid workers, whatever you may want to say. You said something earlier, Gina, which I think is so important. This isn't going away. We often talk about the good old days, how it used to be.
Right.
This is what we're dealing with. Might it transition a little bit? Sure. But this isn't going away. And so how do we not, I think, from an organizational perspective, from a leadership perspective, not become victims? How can we be on top of, in front of this, not necessarily, in the back rooms just complaining about the reality and I wish it was different. And that might be true, but we don't have, I don't think, that luxury as leaders in organizations to, as we used to say when we were kids, bellyache about it. How do we get in front of it?
Sure. There's a couple of things there. One, organizational health. So this decision was made and clearly not communicated well throughout an organization. So that kind of flies in the face of organizational health. Patrick Lencioni is famous for, talking about the single greatest competitive advantage is organizational health. Yeah. Yet it is ignored by most leaders, even though it is simple, free, and available to anyone who wants it. So how does this idea of organizational health connect to keeping our greatest resource, our people, and attracting the right, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gina. I often think about the relationship of organizational health, as we said, to culture. For many years, even prior to working here, had the opportunity to work here at North Group, I would have organizations, because of the role that I was in, they'd ask me to just come and talk to them a little bit about, as an example, an employee appreciation program.
Okay.
And the first
Sounds
question—
good to me.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
Great intention. When I would go in, the first question I would often ask is, how often do you say thank you? And I remember on numerous occasions, the response was, we don't. That's why we need a program. And I challenged them a bit, and my theory has been if it's primarily programmatic, it's problematic. Like really at the end of the day, when you think about culture, this isn't something that we, as my good friend John Zezwitz would say, he talks about the need to codify our values, our culture, but not to calcify them.
Say more.
Well, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
A number of years ago, I was working with an organization, very good organization.
Okay.
And one of the questions that I would ask the individuals I was interacting with on an individual basis was, do you have a mission statement, just as an example? And to a person, I think I was interacting with about maybe 10 individuals at that location. And to a person, they said, absolutely not. And then I said, well, walk with me just for a second. And we walked out into the lobby, and next to the front door was, I didn't measure it, but it looked like to be about 5 foot by 6 foot, whiteboard, black lettering with their mission statement.
Oh, boy.
They would see it every day. That's what I'm talking about in terms of calcifying it, that it wasn't a living breathing document, and it's not just the words, but how are we living this out? And so I don't want to be overly critical of the organization.
Sure.
I'm just saying that is what can happen. We've spent so much time talking about culture, doing the prep on the front side, the values, the vision, the mission, but then it can end. And we have to be very, very intentional about what that culture means and how do we bridge the gap between our intentions and behaviors. I remember years ago, somebody used this phrase that we judge ourselves by our intentions, others judge us by our behaviors. And that really has deep meaning to it. And it is a challenge for us as leaders.
I think of that story. I mean, there are times where we would recommend that you put your mission statement or your core values on the wall. And so this the tension, if you will, between intention and behaviors, how do you prevent that from getting lost? I mean, that's at the core of organizational health, right? So how do you keep that at the forefront, that it is good to put that on the wall, but make sure it's not calcified, if you will?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the things, and some of this isn't that complicated. I'll give you an example of something that I do with my clients.
Okay.
Often is at the beginning of meetings, leadership meetings, wherever it may be, where there's groups of people. I often start off by talking about, what are the best stories from the last 30 days or whatever that time period is that represent the best of our culture. And for two reasons. Number one, it is a way, I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's a way to keep it in front, in this case, the leadership team and I've heard had leadership teams actually start doing that with their teams, their organizations.
Okay, it's almost a trickle down next layer.
Yeah, very much so. And the other thing that it does is it actually is often, it uplifts the meeting. It's just that little bit at the beginning that, okay, we come in from, whatever we're doing, and it can change the dynamic of the meeting.
Yeah, and it starts it on a positive note, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Discussing these things that are making a difference, those behaviors that we do want to see repeated. If I go back to this idea of how culture is connected to employee retention and recruitment, I mean, a lot of folks, we're seeing talk about what I would call the tangibles. So, hey, to keep your people, or the reasons people are moving is for like a bump in salary. So why not? Makes a difference. The cost of everything is higher. We won't go there right now, but that's real. Better benefits. People are making a move for those reasons. More flexible schedules. That's become a priority. And so why not? And then even the remote options. When you think of those factors, how does that, how do you balance those tangible with, I mean, there's a part of organizational health that's intangible. It's hard to measure. It's one of the reasons why sometimes, to Lencioni's point, it gets ignored.
Well, and you and I have often used the term, both and. It's not that it's just one or the other. We need to be paying attention. As an example, for years, I've heard this so many times. We need to at least pay fairly. And sometimes a little bit beyond that. But if you're going to be competing, if somebody's going to leave your organization for $1, they're going to leave somewhere else. They're going to go somewhere else for 50 cents as a rule. People don't leave for that. If you're paying fairly, you think about the culture. And again, neither one of us can sit here and say that's an absolute across the board, but we understand the trends. And so even some of the things I was just reading actually today, a little bit about some of the surveys that were done through Glassdoor, through Gallup, talking about the impact of company culture on the retention piece, and how company culture in one survey was a minimum of 56% was the number that they found in their survey. Rate culture higher than pay.
Interesting.
Again, I'm assuming that we're paying fairly.
Right.
And so it's a both and. We have to pay attention to those things, and we have to be, but if we're not fundamentally creating and sustaining, I think is the big piece here, a culture, it really is quite problematic. We talk about surveys. I was looking at a survey. I love some of the stuff that Gallup does in terms of employee engagement. Now, this is an older survey. I'm sure they've updated it. I can't imagine it's gotten any better. But this was from 2016, pre-pandemic. Now we're on the backside of that.
Right.
But they did a survey, and they found that 23% of U.S. employees strongly agree that they can apply their organization's values to their work every day. Again, only 23%, and only 27% strongly agree that they believe in their organization's values. And you think about that gap where it's like, okay, I see them up on the wall, but it's not lived out within my organization. How can we intentionally live it out? You know, one of the things that you and I often talk about as well is I say, you know, it's not about perfection, it's about direction. And are we moving in a direction when it comes to codifying and then sustaining our culture through our mission, our values, our vision? How are we doing that? And how intentional are we at doing that?
Yeah. I had 3 questions as we wrap up here today that I think leaders can think about, but you are right. Organizational health lies in the gap between our intentions and our behavior. So as leaders, what are our intentions for our people? What do our people believe about our own intentions? And then how close is your daily behavior to those actual intentions?
And for most people don't expect perfection. You know,
that is true.
They want to be, number one, they want to have a fundamental belief in the leaders of their organization, and that what we say is what we are working towards. It's not about perfection. People do not expect that. If we are consistently living it out, and when we fail to live out our culture as we've stated, you know, I always say that the first thing that we should do as a leader is when we mess up, we need to fess up, you know? And so you think about those kinds of things, and that's a powerful thing.
It builds trust.
It absolutely builds trust, which is the foundation.
Right.
You and I believe this fundamentally is the foundation to creating a culture. And then how do we live this out on a day-to-day basis that we don't, you know, it's not a past experience. It's a present reality.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you, Daryl. I hope that our listeners go away encouraged that we can win this battle for recruitment, for retention of our people, especially when we align our intentions and our behaviors.